he said, is fatal to bigots and to ignorance. And I think if the opposite is true, the lack of travel can allow that sort of thing, bigotry, to flourish. And I don't think that happens in the Glenn family. I think we've all sort of come through COVID, and we're coming through COVID in one piece. But one of the things that I found really necessary to do in COVID was think of something else. And the else was what I couldn't do, which was travel, as many of you have not been able to travel either. But I had the joy after of doing tasks around the house. And after I finished alphabetizing my spice shelf, which was really, two angels dancing on the head of a very small pin, I found a box of travel souvenirs in the basement. And I said, this might be the joy here, is pulling out some of these things and just looking at them again and reclaiming some of the space. Well, the box just opened up all sorts of wonderful memories of a particular trip. When I was 29, I began a trip around the world, and it brought me all sorts of adventures. And I've written about them in a book, which I am now shamelessly showing off. One of the most interesting chapters in the book gave it its title, A Wealthy Man on the Roof of the that I met in a part of India that China and Pakistan are still fighting over, way up in the corner. There's been a battle there as recently as the last year. But this gentleman was a trader, and the story of his life and his trades and what became of him just gripped me at the time. And when I read it again, it gripped me all over again. So I wrote down a few stories based on that trip. And a friend of mine, who's a travel editor at National Geographic, said, this is not bad. We're all hungry to travel. Keep writing. So I dug further into those journals, and that led me to some more. And soon I had 200 pages, and I said, that's enough. I'm home. And that's where we got started. That was the beginning of this, which has truly been a sort of a COVID project, but it's taken on legs of its own. And I discovered in the telling of it how much I was telling about myself, which is not always what you want to do. But I realized one of the reasons for it, and I wrote this into the introduction, is because when I got home from this in the world on the Trans-Siberian Railroad, and then China, and then Hong Kong, and then Thailand, and west into India, and up into Nepal and Ladakh, where this wealthy man lived. Then I came home the slow route through the South Pacific Islands. A lot of us don't go to those places. And now that I've been to some of them, I understand why they're not on the top of a lot of people's travel. But it was the rough way. It was on a train, it was on a boat, it was on a bus. And it formed, for me, indelible impressions of the world. And when I got home, everybody wanted to hear about it, but only for about 5 minutes. Because if you've ever been invited to watch somebody's slides, this is an old technology, but I think there's new references to it or new ways to do it. And you run for the hills because you know what's coming up. You're going to be trapped for 3 hours in a dark room. I understood the motive to not listen in a few minutes, but I also, well, maybe I do have something to say. So I've written it down, and I have enjoyed my neighbors and my friends responding to some of those stories in ways that I think are really positive. Susan, what do you think?
That's great. I love the opening and background. And does anyone want to start off with some questions? And I've got a couple prompts here I can pull up that Sally had suggested as well.
One thing I thought about it is it reads just, it's like being with Sally. It just sounds like Sally.
Thank you, Sharon. I'm going to take that in the nicest possible way.
Nice way.
A friend of mine has reminded me that I am not Hemingway, to which I like to respond, well, heck, I'm not Tolstoy either. So let's not go too long on anything, but let's not pretend I have crafted the perfect sentence here. This is a travel memoir about the people I met and the places I went, and the attitude I took with me, and what attitude I came home with. A lot of the early chapters, as I had left Moscow, on the Trans-Siberian. That's an 8-day trip. And I was alone in a car full of Swedish tourists because they didn't know what other car to put me in. And I didn't know enough about the system to realize until I got stuck that the last two cars of the train were full of North Koreans who never got off the train in that entire week that we were together. But when I did run into them at this one point early in the story, they were brutal on how come America is keeping them separate from their South Korean brothers. And I was 29. I had never thought much about the Korean War, let alone whether we Americans were exclusively responsible for separating that peninsula. They let me have it. And as I got to the Russian border, the border with China, these great communist nations, this is the Cold War. Russia was crumbling, and China was on the ascendancy. But I realized that America didn't really mount to much over there. The fights were within themselves. And I was able to take a deep gulp of American take a step back attitudes that I think have served me pretty well in my reporting, because what we see here is local. And it doesn't really involve the newsrooms I had left in Birmingham and Memphis were in the American South and still referred to China as Red China. And Chi-Com was a term of approbation. Let's just leave them alone. So all of those things featured in the early weeks of my trip was figuring out what's America's place in the world, what's my place in this world, and how have we either had a thumb on the scales that has turned out well or poorly. Those were some of the earliest adventures. When I got to China, it was 82, the fall of 1982, and foreigners had just been allowed in, and they were not allowed in much for independent travel like I was trying to do. So I had to figure out a way around some of the rules and rent a bicycle. And the renting of the bicycle in Beijing on Chang'an Street, Jiangqiu Minwai. I mean, these streets are not even there anymore because China's changed so much. But back then it was just crazy. I was one of the tallest people on the street. I'm not a tall woman. And recognizing that everybody was wearing a blue Mao suit and I was in a bright yellow American raincoat, it was very apart feeling. And to go around the world and feel apart is useful. It's not great, and it's certainly not much fun to stay that way. But the further I went and the more I was able to talk to people, the easier it became to understand more about their lives and try to separate it from my own.
Ellie, I
That's great.
missed at the very beginning. Did you say what prompted you to take this trip?
Well, I was turning 30. I was 28 when I started planning it, and I was 29. I knew that I loved TV news. I loved news because it had been my family's business, but I also knew that TV was just a great way to do it. And you don't get vacations in TV news. And when you do go to places, they've either had the tornado come through or something was on fire. So I wasn't going to see the beautiful parts of the world on a TV news vacation for a long time. Plus my grandfather, who had been a great traveler, had just died. And I thought, this is it. I'm going to finish this assignment in Memphis. And before I take the next one, I'm going to travel. And that's what prompted the trip. And I think turning 30 does that for a lot of people. And being in a profession for 5 years. The Memphis Police Union was on before I left. And I talked to a lot of police officers about why they liked their job. This is 1981 and 82. Ronald Reagan was freshly in office. Jimmy Carter had just lost. It was pretty interesting time. But the cops said things like, well, 5 years is the moment. You've been a cop for 5 years and you've got to re-up. And either you recognize that you're not going to change the whole world, you're not going to fix everything, but you can be, the best cop you can be. That kind of attitude helped me to think about what I wanted to do, with the understanding that I was not going to change the world with my reporting or covering police unions either, for that matter. But it was important to sort of get a grounding on why I wanted to do what I have now continued to do for the almost 40 years since I got home.
And then to build on that, the why of doing this book, you've talked a little bit about that with COVID and the wanting to travel when you couldn't. Do you want to talk a little bit about why? And then for those of us who don't have the book in front of us, it might be, if you, your notes to me, you talked about the titles of the chapters. If you even wanted to read those to us and kind of give us insight into why you did it in that order. I thought that was a really fun discussion.
That was fun. I would write 2 or 3 pages at a time. And I recognized that 2 or 3 pages is pretty much the limit for TV news. And I thought, wow, I am not even trying to be Tolstoy, but couldn't I be a little longer than 1.5 minutes? And the answer is no. That habit of writing for 30, 40 years has kind of cut my attention span down. And that was useful as a device. It's also really important for people to see that what you do actually changes you. I could have written a lot longer then, but perhaps now I'm just shorter. At any rate, I wrote little chapters, and I've had friends say I was going to fall asleep, but the next chapter was short, so I kept going. I thought that was kind of kind. I start in Russia at the deepest lake in the world. And the next chapter is leaving Moscow, exploring the train, having cognac for breakfast, and then left behind on the steppes. That's the one that gives my sister pause yet about leaving the passport behind. Eating my way across Siberia. If any of you have been on a long train trip, you know how much fun and how critical, or on a cruise ship, you're always thinking about the next meal and what's going to be for dessert. Well, there wasn't a lot of dessert in Siberia. Then Sergei and Willie Nelson. Why did the Mongols wander? The train raced a couple of Mongol horsemen at one point. And finally, how the Soviets say goodbye. Very different from how the Chinese said hello as we crossed the border there in Manchuria between Russia and China. Renting a flying pigeon. That was the name of the bicycle in China. A nightcap at the Jinjiang Club. This was my best hangover story of the whole trip. And it was a bad hangover. The Chinese have not developed the way to make the drink that some people call scotch, some people call whiskey, version of it. And I was rough the next morning. Then I swanned about Thailand. I was welcomed to India, and then spent the night at a tea plantation in Darjeeling, or Darjeeling, as they said. A walk for pleasure. A shortcut up the Himalayan mountains was agony. And finally, Thanksgiving greetings from Kathmandu. That was a letter home to mom and dad. Y'all may appreciate, because some of you may have saved letters from your children, or cleaned out your parents' homes and found that they had saved letters from you. Well, I wrote a letter to mom and dad from Thanksgiving when we had gotten to Kathmandu because I was so homesick, and they kept it. And rereading that letter now that I had written then formed the basis for a chapter that was just sweet. I was a better writer then than I remember now that I was. So that was sort of fun to recall. Toward Annapurna. And fertilizer is like heroin. This is sort of a corruption story that I discovered talking to government officials and to expatriates who were observing this at a much longer stay in these places than I had had. Then comes a wealthy man on the roof of the world right after Christmas in a Buddhist kingdom. Finally, an elephant hunts a rare rhino. That was a letter to my grandmother that I wrote about an elephant hunt in the Terai in India. And she loved it and she kept it. And when mom cleaned out her house, she picked up that letter and stuck it with the letters I'd written to her that she said. So I had this trove of family letters. Now, we're not all pack rats. Some of you may appreciate that. But the fact that they valued these letters told me a lot about my family. And it also reminded me what I used to write home. Does anybody else remember those aerograms? Has anybody tried to explain what a little blue flimsy aerogram is to their grandchildren? Yeah, well, that's what these were written on. They're remarkably durable for something that went around the world and was in the hands of all sorts of mail carriers. Finally, when I got to the Pacific, the chapters go, okay, Perth. That was the first English language I'd seen in months. And every billboard I would stop and read, and every shop window would have cards and writing in it. And I mean, after a few hours, I was just spent from rereading English for the first time in so long. Then I crossed the Great Victoria Desert. That's where I ran into the ghost of Herbert Hoover, our American president. Wonders down under, and jokes in the Antipodes. Those jokes had a remarkable World War II quality to them. Then I went to Suva and Fiji, and beyond that to fish of another reef that always go back to their own reef. By this time it was Easter, and I wrote about the church services on Palm Sunday and Easter in the first, I don't think it was a Methodist church. I think it was the only church on the island, first Christian church of Rarotonga. We should all go there one day because that was worth it. And finally, coconut cream in my coffee. That was when it was time to come home. Those are the chapters. Melissa Fay Green read she's our great neighbor, as you perhaps know, married to Don Samuel, the great defense attorney. And she's written a lot of wonderful stories, Praying for Sheetrock, the temple bombing. I asked her to take a look to make sure I was on the right track. And she said the list of titles alone made her breathless. Windswept was her word. So by the time I got home, I was ready to be home and ready to find another job in TV news, which I did in Dallas. But forgive me if I'm offending anybody. There were just too many people from Texas in Dallas. And I quickly decided that an offer from Atlanta would be welcome, and came here then to work at what was then the CBS affiliate, Channel 5. And that's where I met Richard, and Glenn Church came along not much later than that.
That's great. Wow. I love the run through. Yeah, I bet that brought up some questions if y'all want to talk. I mean, you covered so much just in the titles of the chapters. I love it.
That's the problem with Texas. It's full of Texans.
Perhaps that was not very diplomatic of me to say, but it was the main reason. When I realized that Atlanta at that time had the chief executive officer of Fulton County was married to a poet, Pearl Clegg at the time, Michael Lomax. I thought, well, there may be a little more depth there. And I was not wrong.
Sally, what did you do about the languages? You talk about being weary from reading English again, but you learned enough Russian and Chinese to get you by, or you were all over in so many different languages. I just wondered how you navigated all that.
Trial and error, and I depended heavily on guidebooks from The Lonely Planet. And I will say, even then, I found the typeface in The Lonely Planet too small. I'd have to put on glasses. What's up with this? But the infrastructure of tourism was intense. And of course, the now sad legacy of colonialism, Gerald, was thriving, particularly in India. Everybody spoke a lot of English that was in the business of providing, a house or a tea stall, or enough to say, go this way or go that way. China was different. They wanted to practice their English there. And there were people that ran from me because I was so white. There are many places on this trip that I'd like to go back to and see how different they are now, and see how the onrush of 30 or 40 years of prosperity has made a difference. But it hasn't all been that way. The last dying days of the English Raj were in full display in Darjeeling. And that's undoubtedly gone because of Maoist insurgencies and Indian government, and a pretty good time figuring out how other people govern themselves and why our beloved institutions don't necessarily work very well in other parts of the world. It brought me home willing to listen a lot more than I had listened before I went.
I have a question.
Great.
Susan?
Go for it, Melvin.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, Sally, this is Melvin, and
Hey,
please
Melvin.
don't say I know who you are. But anyway, in your travels, this is an unusual question, but anyway, in your travels, have you ever eating octopus, not lobster, but octopus?
Oh, yeah.
But
Yes.
anyway, the reason I brought that up, Bruce and I was somewhere in a restaurant, wherever, and they had octopus on the menu. And he said, Daddy, I think we ought to try it. I said, you can try it, but I'm not eating anything with 8 legs.
Yeah, we were actually at Gaddy's restaurant at the Peninsula Hotel in Hong Kong. And very innocently, we ordered the seafood platter. There was nothing on the platter that we could identify. It was all very exotic.
But did it all taste like chicken?
Yeah.
Well, those are one of the reasons that I think Mark Twain said travel is fatal to bigotry. It can also be fatal to your stomach and your digestive system for at least a few moments. I will ask Melvin, just because you know Richard Belcher would want me to, if any of the legs on those octopus were wearing Bermuda shorts in a bright plaid. Okay, enough for the Melvin jokes. We love you, Melvin. Yeah, eating oddball things or seeing that your reaction to oddball things was distressing to your hosts because it let them know that you didn't think it was good enough. Those were lessons you needed to learn. But of course, at risk, I spent, felt like 2 months eating only rice and brushing my teeth with boiled tea, which was pretty rough on my mouth, but I never got sick. I never got dysentery. I never got, and people would claim these tremendous illnesses. Nobody over there had a cold. They always had dysentery. Nobody over there was just, falling down with a stomach ache. They were dying from some internal disease that was awful. And in too many cases, they were right. I mean, there's a lot of problems over there. Hiking up the Himalaya, I met a woman who was probably just a few years older than me. She was grandmother, and she was deeply sunbrowned, and she was very dusty. And I was pretty dusty. And there was a group of ponies were coming down the mountain from China into Tibet on a mountain pass. I think I've got a picture of it in here. And she was dirty too. And she let me know, I think this is terrible reproduction. I apologize. But if you can see her, she's over here in the corner with the basket on her back. And here come the ponies tromping down the mountain steps. She pointed out how clean I was compared to her. And the idea of taking a bath in many of those places or cleaning or having enough water for your own needs was very difficult, costly, and harmful. I learned later from some friends at the at the Save the Children Fund, whom I met a few weeks later on the road, that the dust in the air was so harmful to young children that they had significantly higher problems with it. I mean, and that's simple cleanliness. That's not whether you're eating anything bad or not. So a lot of those kinds of lessons went along with octopus, Melvin.
Sally, perhaps you said this in the beginning. How long were you gone? Is one question I have. And the other one, was there any time on this trip that you felt you were in danger?
The rhino and the elephant hunt, that was danger. And I felt like I had put myself in it. I was riding on an elephant back in very tall grass. So all you could see was me sort of at knee level on top of this elephant. And the rhino was much lower than an elephant. So we were riding through this sea of grass, hunting for a rhino, and rhinos are mean. This was a particularly mean one because they were about to become extinct. So I don't know if the gene pool was crying to this poor rhino. But once we surrounded him with the other people who were on a few other elephants, it was scary because he was turning and running and threatening, and you could barely see him. So that was scary. At no other point did I feel at risk from fellow travelers or from government officials or from people I met on the road. At no point. Maybe I was foolish. Well, I'm sure I was foolish. what am I saying? Of course, I took risks with my passport and with my person that I'm not sure I would have advised somebody my age to do, looking back on it. And I was gone. I left in September and came back after Easter in late April of that year, 82 and 83.
It's a long time.
It was a long time, and I was homesick, and Thanksgiving was tough. Christmas was awful.
Yeah.
Christmas, I was in Ladakh. That was the next day that I met the wealthiest man on the roof of the world. But it was cold. Everybody around was Buddhist. The Christians that were there had come 200 or 300 years earlier, and they had managed to make about 7 converts in 200 or 300 years. This was not a place that was welcoming that I could see. But I was traveling at that point with a fellow from Germany and a fellow from Japan and a companion of mine who had flown over from Memphis to meet me. And we were walking down the streets of this deep ravines, and monasteries are all built on the walls of the mountains around us. We were at, I don't know, 12, 13,000 feet. It's hard to breathe, but we started singing Silent Night together, Christmas hymns. And I have never felt so lonesome and so close in my life as that night, Christmas Eve, in the mountain kingdom of a Buddhist nation.
Yes, Sally, I have one more question.
Go, Melvin.
Yeah, are you making plans for your next trip? Where you plan to go?
Oh, what a good question. Where's everybody else planning? I mean, excuse me, once we can get free, where do we all want to go besides, you know, the beach or the mountains of North Georgia or someplace where our friends are? I'm ready to get to the Galapagos. That's on my bucket list. And I want to go to the Holy Land. Somebody asked me why I picked Russia to go through. And the route around the world at the time was really just 2 choices if you wanted to be on land much, and it was north through Russia or right through the middle of the Middle East. And I do not think I would have felt so safe then. It was not particularly a good idea for women, particularly Christian women, to travel alone in the Middle East then. I mean, it was all Soviet Union satellites once you get past Turkey, and they didn't like us much. I'm not sure they will do.
Sally?
Yes, sir.
This is Dave Spino. How are you?
Hey, Dave, how are you? Good to hear from you.
Really enjoying your talk. You mentioned that you were with fellow travelers. I'm curious as how did you meet some of these people and how long did you stay with them? And were they doing somewhat similar to what you were doing, traveling for the experience of it?
Yes is the easy answer, and specifically 2 or 3 days at a time, and it would be intense and personal, and then it would be over. You know, you'd meet somebody. Well, a perfect example is Kathmandu. Kathmandu in 1982 and 83 was still coming off the Beatles song Kathmandu, and it was a dope heaven, and people wore, you know, bright colored outfits. It was very much more colorful and even a little bit more American than China, certainly, or Russia. But there would be posts in the various tourist hostels that would offer friendship or a bus ride or want to share. At this point, I was traveling with my beau from Memphis who had joined me, and we would agree that what we really wanted to see was sunrise over Mount Everest, say. And we did that. And we traveled with a couple who were expatriates from America and from England. And we traveled with them for 2 days. We spent the night at the hotel up by the rim of the mountains where you could see Everest. This was a little known fact. You get to Kathmandu and you can't see Mount Everest because it's in a little shallow dish. You have to get up on the rim of the mountains, the foothills, to be able to see Everest. And there we were. This particular couple we stayed with for 2 days. We traveled together, we ate together, we heard their stories, and their disillusionment with the world of Nepal and the world of India coming up just let me realize these folks are professional expatriates. I've thought about that couple a lot. I don't think they would be happy anywhere. And so you might as well keep traveling. But they were fun to travel with. They were experienced. They knew what to avoid and what to take part in. And that whole world of meeting up with people, Dave Spino, I bet you've seen it before. You've seen it in your scout work for sure. And maybe all the rest of us who've ever, been flying on an airplane and found yourself telling some of the secrets of your heart to the person sitting next to you, because you'll never see them again.
Right. Hopefully.
Yeah. There was a little of that.
Thank you,
That
Sally.
may be good.
It may be very good. Well, it does help you realize what the secrets of your heart really are, which is pretty useful.
Sally, did you work out your itinerary yourself before you made your trip?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. And I made sure I wrote it down. And this was in the days when the American Express card was your green passport to money and to places. And American Express then offered, I don't know if it still does, to hold letters for you at the American Express office in some particular city. So I let everybody know, my family, my friends, I'm going to be in Kathmandu, for example, or one of my favorites was in Sri Lanka. The American Express office was in a massive colonial 3-story marble, fabulous English looking building. I wonder what it looks like today, because it certainly looked like colonial powers were flexing their muscles there. But you'd go up the steps and there would be a little sign the American Express office was pretty big because they wanted you to buy traveler's checks and cash traveler's checks. But there'd be a sign that said, mail delivery over here, pick up mail. So I would go and pick up 2 or 3 letters often in these towns that had been sent to me by my friends. And the longer I stayed, the further behind I got on my itinerary. So the letters got older and older, but they were pretty good. There was one absentee ballot. This was fun to remember in the fall when we were all having fits over our absentee ballots. If anybody remembers that little fun in Georgia politics. Well, there had been an absolutely insignificant race in my home in Shelby County, Alabama. I think it was clerk of the court. And I had cast my ballot at home before I went, as I remember, but they mailed me my absentee ballot for the runoff. And it got to me in Hong Kong, and it had been forwarded from somewhere. Oh, Russia. It was. They sent to me in the Soviet Union, and it got forwarded to Hong Kong. And I cast the ballot and tried to send it back, and something went wrong. At any rate, I had that ballot with me for weeks, just proving that the U.S. mail and international mail can help you. I don't think I cost or gained the election for the clerk of the court. She'd been a friend of my parents. And I wanted her to win, and I think she did win. But it was just fun seeing what the rest of the world does with something marked official U.S. absentee ballot, Shelby County, Alabama. It was worth something.
That's great.
It seems to me, Sally, what I meant when I said the book sounds like you. You had these talents of interviewing people that you use now, but you have them even back then. Just the ability to go into a strange situation and find something to say that gets people to open up to you.
Well, thank you, Sharon. Thank you. And I think some of what that is listening. And I found that if you do that with a willing ear and a willing heart, people want to tell you stuff. People don't want to be strangers, mostly. There's crooks and bad guys and all sorts of stuff. But I learned a lot on this trip about just paying attention. And of course, when I came home and people didn't want to pay attention to me, I, wrote a little of this down and then packed it up because it mattered more to me. And I didn't want to overwhelm somebody. No, you must listen to my 7th hour of this diatribe about this great trip I went on. Plus, there was some jealousy working. And I think that it's always good to be aware of how you appear to others that way, because talk about privilege. I did not stay in 4-star hotels. I stayed in hotels that did not have a star. But it was abundant everywhere I went, the privilege that I had just with the past. And
Yeah.
now when we look back on privilege, now that privilege is one of those headline bad ideas, you know, I have really had to reconcile some of what I accepted without thought as the way the world works, that bowed and scraped and gave me a platform then to have a more comfortable night than I would have if I hadn't looked like I do or spoken like I do. So listening's important. Listening helps people think they can share something with you, and if you talk back with them as if you understand and in fact do or are truly seeking to hear them, it's usually a pretty good outcome, and it was for me all over.
Sally, would you say that your listening skills were in a sort of baby state at that time, and this trip actually had that mature for you? And because I'm leading to the other question is there anything that about these travels that informs you today in a particular way?
Yes, I think the fight over American exceptionalism that I see in ways small and large, the fight over local control in government, some of the things that we accept now that are in the headlines, listening more deeply for what really is underneath, I learned a lot about that then. And of course, it's helped me in the years since to try to figure out what really is the fight about, if there is to be a fight. Is this a stalking horse? Is this a thin veneer? Is the Methodist Church fight, I won't take a side on this one, about LGBTQ, about power, about money, about biblical inaccuracy, errancy? Or is it just what humans do to each other, since the Apostle Paul was messing around with starting new congregations and coming back and seeing how they'd gone astray? I've learned a lot from Glenn Church about how to listen. And it has been very helpful because it's never so simple. If you expect people to have goodwill, you're right more often than you're wrong. And it helps you just to be a better person, I think. But those are some of the skills that I learned over there. What I say before we go is the value of a tourist had never occurred to me. And it occurs to me now as we're coming out of the pandemic, that it's a sturdy business with lots of people who sort of float in and out of it, like a restaurant stall or something. But there are some people deep in the middle of India who are probably, waiting for oxygen and waiting for vaccinations right now. When I was there, their dads probably, or maybe grandfathers, were standing on the lip of a beautiful cave that I had never heard of, the caves of Ellora and Ajanta in the middle of India. They were lost to Western contact for hundreds of years, but the Buddhist carvings inside the wall of one of those caves was too dark for people to see because there certainly wasn't any electricity. So they had men supporting the tourist industry, independent, who would stand at the lip of the cave with these great mirrors and guide the angle of the sun into the cave so that it would illuminate the carvings that we'd come so far to see. And I thought, well, that's nice. And then, of course, after I could see and explore it to my heart's content, when I would walk out of the cave, these guys would hit me up for a few rupees. And I thought, well, I wouldn't have seen it without them, so I paid. When we're not there, those guys don't get rupees. The value of a tiny tourist rupee that to me was just thanks for the electricity, buddy, or thanks for the view, is so great. And to stop it alters lives, alters communities. I see so many people on tourists who get criticized for being tourists and tromping around the world and acting like Americans everywhere. And it is pretty clear when you go around the world who the Americans are and who we're not, by our stride and our clothing and our attitude
And our health.
and our hair. Oh my God. Yes.
No, we look so healthy.
Well, yeah. And our teeth. Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Yeah. And some of it is unconscious. And of course, a lot of it goes to the very human nature of wanting to travel with people who are like you so that you can share the experience on the spot, which is not the same, but it's also got its own good sides. But the value of going places and letting people help you, like those mirror wallahs did, help me to see inside that cave, was something that I think we underestimate when we talk about Americans tromping all over all the sacred spots of the world. So that was pretty useful.
Sally, I have just, how do you think you had, I could never have done this at age 29. That was a lot of, so something in your being or the way that you were raised clearly enabled you to do such a trip. Do you have any idea about your inner self and why you, I mean, that was really brave.
Well, thank
From
you.
Alabama too.
And from no less from Alabama. Wow.
I'm from Alabama, Sally, so I can say that.
Oh, I know. And you and I both know those jokes about the best thing that comes out of Alabama is I-20, get me out of Alabama. That's a reason that a lot of people from Alabama like to travel, but everybody, I think, likes to see other things if they can feel safe or under control at varying amounts. My family was just sort of wanderers. There's pioneers in my family and people who were on the wrong side of the American Indian Wars and benefited from some of those things, but always looking for a new frontier is a great way to think about being a good journalist, I think. If you're looking for where the edge is, what's the new, what's the strange. And my dad loved it. He had been in the Philippines in the Second World War and he went to Fiji. So a letter I wrote him from Fiji turned out to be very useful because he saved it. And when I got back, I could see what it looked like. But he always loved new places and Mom followed him in that everywhere. When we were kids, they put us in the back seat of the station wagon, my brother and my sister and I, and we drove from the middle of Alabama to the Panama Canal because we'd never seen it. And that kind of attitude about people will generally be warm and loving if you let them, led us a long way. And I think that's what helped me feel reassured that if I traveled, I'd be okay. And it'd be true.
But we've seen you do that when you were a reporter for WSB, and we've seen you stand in the rain in godforsaken part of Atlanta. And Alan would say to the TV, Sally, get out of there, go home.
Just one moment. I will be done in a minute. Thank you. Yes, well, Alan's right. Alan was always right, of course. But it would be easier to look and peer than to stand back and wonder if somebody else is going to do it.
Mm-hmm. Well, if this hasn't made you want to get a copy of Sally's book, I don't know what will. So it's fun. So
How do we do that, Susan?
Yeah, so that was, I was going to ask, it sounds like some local booksellers here in Atlanta, of course, have copies of your book, right?
They seem to be running out, which is just a great treat for me. I have offered to Cindy to bring a few copies to her if she would like to be my agent. She hasn't signed on to that yet. But the easiest way is sallysears.com. Being a writer means you get to have a website. So I've got one called sallysears.com. And there you can click on the button that says buy now, and it'll take you to Amazon or to Barnes and Nobles, and they will send you the book. They will mail it to you, and it's $15. And I think they charge $1 or so for shipping. But I'm happy to bring them to people if they'd like them. I did not write this for fame and fortune. I wrote it for a lot of good reasons. And I don't know, fame is kind of coming with it. Turns out that story from Fiji, this was, my dad had served there, so I wanted to go there and see what it looked like from a non-USGI eyes. And when you fly into Fiji, or when I flew into Fiji, there was a huge display of cannibal artifacts in the airport. I thought, that does not seem too welcoming. I mean, it didn't say Methodists here, because those were the missionaries they seemed to eat the most. And they had a lot of stuff about, missionaries who had come and they would end up in the stew pot. So I wrote about that and listed it on the Amazon description of this book. And wouldn't you know, that's the one that rang the bells with Amazon readers. I am a best-selling Amazon author in the category of Fiji cannibals.
Congratulations.
How can this be? This can't be right. And surely they don't have that display up anymore, but I thought it was awesome.
That's great.
Sally, my experience with somebody else's book is you don't get very much if you sell it on Amazon, whereas you might get more as a bookstore. Which place will you get the largest cut of your book if we bought it?
Well, you're so sweet. Try Eagle Eye.
Okay.
They sent me a check yesterday for the first 20 copies that had sold, and that was sweet. Or I really am, Gatra, happy to bring copies to y'all, Claremont Place, and I'll get all the money from that if you want.
All right.
And
do
I could
that.
make you a
That'd be great.
deal.
Wow. Yeah, Sally.
Melvin.
Sally. Melvin again. Yeah, I was thinking, that would make an if you bought 50.
Well, Melvin, I'm going to make sure you get one.
I always looking for a bar.
Well, I do want to make sure that y'all
it.
know there's a little Christian faith in here, not a lot, but Easter in the Cook Islands, I went to listen to the church service. And of course, it was in Maori. I do not speak Maori, and I'm unlikely to, but they sang Jesus Christ is Risen Today on Easter Sunday in Rarotonga. And I was able to sing along, or at least hum along. It filled me in that way that Christmas Eve had done in Ladakh. And there it was. And they were in the middle of a drought then. This is Easter Sunday, and it had been very dry, and the preacher prayed for rain. And I could tell he was praying for rain because of his hand gestures. And finally, this is on page 185 of the book. Send us rain, he prayed out loud. Fill our water tanks, O Lord, in English. And after feast, we all went outside the church. Everybody had on fancy hats, and there was a feast spread out that people had brought themselves. They did not have the varsity, I'm glad to say. But everybody ate and everybody nibbled. And by the time the last dish was finished, it started to rain.
Oh, wow.
Oh,
It was
That's
rich.
great. Oh, well, that's wonderful. Well, I know we could hear you talk for days, but I think we need to actually wrap up and buy the book ourselves or borrow a copy. But let's, as I've learned from the confirmands on their Zoom calls, doing confirmation on Zoom, you can do a round of applause with your hands on here so everyone can see the hands, since it's hard to hear everyone. So let's do a round of applause for Sally, and thank you.
Thank you, Sally.
Thank you all. You're so sweet. And I
Thank
do
you for everyone
appreciate
being with us today. And we greatly appreciate your time, Sally.
Thank you. And happy times ahead for Glen Church. And I look forward so much to seeing each of you again in person in our beautiful sanctuary and outside it.
Yes.